Now I'm pleased to introduce as our presenter former Dayton, Ohio Chief of Police Richard Biehl. Richard is a pioneer in meditation and yoga for the law enforcement community. We benefit here once again this evening from him being an active adult learner, now in postmaster's degree studies and research. Richard is the former director and chief of police at the Dayton, Ohio Police Department. He was appointed to this position by City Manager Rashad Young on January 28, 2008, and retired on July 30, 2021, after spending 13 plus years as chief of police and nearly 43 years in public and community service. Prior to his service in Dayton, Chief Biehl served 24 plus years as a Cincinnati police officer, and for the last 6 years of his career in Cincinnati as an assistant police chief. He commanded both the Investigations Bureau and the Administration Bureau. His principal areas of responsibility include internal investigations, planning and special projects, youth services, criminal investigation, general vice control, and intelligence. Chief Biehl is a former competitive powerlifter and martial artist, and his athletic pursuits included regional, national, and international sporting events spanning 1976 to 1992. Nearly 30 years ago, Chief Biehl began to practice yoga as a means to emerge from 2 years of chronic depression. In 2015, Chief Biehl authored the chapter Trauma in the Theater of the Body, which was published in the book Moving Consciously: Somatic Transformation Through Dance, Yoga, and Touch, where he discusses the potential of yoga to mitigate and heal trauma. In 2020, Chief Biehl completed a master's degree in mindfulness studies at Lesley University. He has presented an introduction to mindfulness practice to several conferences and local workshops. He incorporates mindfulness within his yoga teaching. Thank you for being with us once again here, Chief. I'll turn it over.
You're most welcome. So are we ready?
We are ready.
Well, let's go.
Great.
So this is a really just brief, 10 slides. It'll walk through some of the key components of an academic paper I wrote, which is called Adversity, Suffering, and Personal Search for Inner Peace, Ease, and Balance. So here we go. So this paper, the intention of at least the assignment was to bring a lens of personal reflection on resilience and to weave in the paper response to an analysis of existing literature read thus far. And so we'll touch on some of the materials actually that was covered in this paper. A functional definition and framing of resilience will be provided with the understanding there is no agreed upon consensus still as it relates to the definition of or conceptualization of resilience. So is a field still in development. Also discuss briefly a new proposed approach to mindfulness, which was a part of what I examined because it was one of the books we were reading. I want to introduce Bo Forbes. Actually, I was going through some prior presentations, and her work around interoceptive awareness and its link to or not to mental health conditions was really fascinating, and it really mirrored a lot of my personal experience. And it will focus on this bottom-up versus top-down processing. She has some interesting insights. She is a therapist, but also a yoga teacher. And then what I discovered and what I learned from these mind-body practices, yoga being primary, which but not the only one, and then hopefully an opportunity to prompt some dialogue around these and other topics that may emerge. So to go to a definition of resilience, I particularly like this definition from, in essence, Heart Math Institute, but McCready and Atkinson were one of their papers, but it's also reflected in a book, The Coherent Heart, Heart-Brain Interactions, Psychophysiological Coherence in the Emergence of System-Wide Order. Heart Math has been a pioneer in this area of developing coherent state throughout multiple organ systems physiologically that affects people also in terms of emotionality, spirituality, their physical well-being. So just real true pioneers. So what they basically said is that resilience is a capacity to prepare for, recover from, and adapt to stress, adversity, trauma. And he also mentioned, or stress, and he also mentioned this, it's the ability to build and sustain resilience is related to self-management and efficient utilization of energy resources. That was a key point. It's about energy resources across these four domains. Now, one of the texts that we covered, and I'll mention here in a minute, by Amit Sood, he also adds social, and I would add that also. So I think that would round out this entire definition, but I think it does a great job of providing a simple, pretty simple explanation or description of resilience, as well as flushing that out about what does that look like in terms of personal experience? And it's through these domains that occurs. So the book is Mindfulness Redesigned for the 21st Century. And Amit Sood is what used to be with the Mayo Clinic. And they had a program that they developed there for well-being. They had a lot of positive psychology elements to it, but it went beyond that. So his book here was written in 2018, and he had certain challenges that he raised related to mindfulness research. He found that a number of the studies suffered from low quality. A number of them indicated weak effects of mindfulness when it was implemented. Different types of mindful practices employed made study comparisons difficult. I also found that in research in terms of compassion therapy when I did my thesis. There were just multiple forms of compassion therapy. It was hard to really compare them because they're different approaches. And also programs that also include yoga practices, which make evaluation of the causal path of benefits observed less clear, as well as other challenges. So those are the issues he raised, not the only ones. Excuse me. He also brought this perspective. He said, that he contends that these modern mindfulness practices are unsuitable for the current societal environment, which is dominated by an ever increasingly, actually accelerating pace of change. I don't think we could dispute that, adding to its inherent complexity and unpredictability. And he said that, given our neurological drive of humans for this predictability and control, which is ever less achievable, and the existence of neural traits, he actually calls them traps, that conspire to capture our thoughts, words, and actions, it makes it extremely difficult, if not impossible, to constantly live in the present moment and also to maintain a non-judgmental stance. So that's his framework or his view for advocating for a different type of mindfulness. So this is what he has proposed. And actually, there's another book he published in 2019 called SMART, which is stress management and resilience training. And that's where a lot of the more detail regarding this exists also. And I did some research in my final paper related to the implementation of SMART. I won't get into that here, but it has been subjected to empirical study. So what's his approach? Well, first, he says it has to include three components. First is insight, awareness of how the mind operates. And there's particularly these neural traps. He mentions 13, but of particular interest is basically this focus, the challenge of maintaining focus in this modern era, fatigue, that the brain fatigues and needs rest. So constant focus and concentration is difficult to maintain. And also fear, or what's called the negativity bias, the tendency for us to focus on those things that are perceived as threatening, which is part of our evolutionary heritage, if you will. It's a protective mechanism, but it has certainly some downsides. Also attention, and by that he means deep, sustained, strong, intentional attention, he describes it, which is driven by inner meaning. And he gives examples of these practices of a morning gratitude practice, what he calls a 2-minute rule, which is pretty fascinating. It's meeting someone, whether it's a family member, it's a coworker, a friend, but as if you had never met them before for 2 minutes. So fascination of discovery of a person as if you've never met them before, even though you know them. Also curious moments, which is finding the extraordinary and the ordinary, and also kind attention throughout the day, extending kind intentions toward people through one's thought process. And then lastly, it's this a mindset. So these are the 3 components. And the 5 core principles of this mindset for gratitude, compassion, acceptance, meaning, and forgiveness. And those are actually, he maps those out. His practice is during 5 days a week, Monday through Friday. He will practice one of those each of those days. So that's a particular practice that he endorses. So Bo Forbes actually wrote this book. I have not read the book, and I actually forgot that she had written it, but I remembered her presentation, which just really riveted me. But she says in a YouTube presentation, how many times do you know, I'm sorry, this is her book. She says this, how many times have you known what your issues are, yet not being able to change them? We basically engage in the same patterns. There could be behavioral patterns, thinking patterns, emotional patterns. But we know there's something we need to change, but we lack the capability to do so. So he said, in other words, taking part in her perspective, it's a therapy session. So he's talking about therapeutic session, is that not only, or perhaps not even primarily, the key to change. It's not talking about it. She actually says conceptual insight is not required for change. In some cases, it can actually interfere with it. And by working with body-based realm, we can bypass this mental interference. We can feel rather than think the emotional experience. They heal us. And she follows with this, that this discovery rocked my professional world. To be honest, she said, I grieved over it almost as much as I celebrated it. For many psychotherapists, the ability to process is an almost sacred gift. Language is the medium through which we share that gift with our clients. We spend considerable resources refining the art of listening, interpreting, reflecting back what our clients tell us. Yet, despite my mixed feelings about it, therapy constantly yielded better results when clients practiced more than they processed. Fascinating. And because that, quite honestly, was the answer for me to get out of depression. It wasn't talking, didn't move the needle. It was processing that through movement, breath, and awareness. So this is a YouTube it's about a 45 minute or so YouTube. I'm just going to show us a small portion of this YouTube. In fact, it's only a couple minutes.
We start to look at interoceptive disorders as issues where we have a lack of cohesive sense of the body. There's not an internal cohesion, and our body maps are off. And it turns out that that's true in a lot of clinical syndromes, and particularly in post-traumatic stress disorder, or whenever we've had a certain kind of trauma. So one of the things that we can acknowledge is that having a history of trauma of any kind, it makes it really difficult to inhabit this body. The wilderness of the body becomes a really scary place. But also not being in this body is itself a form of trauma. And so when we start to think about ourselves as having learned to not be in our bodies, there's a sense of trauma that comes with that. And I've been exploring some of the research in pain and other issues and starting to find some interesting connections with a lack of interoceptive awareness and pain and trauma. And so one of the interesting things is then looking at people that have thoracolumbar spine pain, you would expect to see that certain receptors are firing a lot, right? They're over-firing. And in fact, what we're starting to see is that when they go in to actually measure the firing, nothing's happening. Those receptors have been killed off. So then you might wonder with that, you would expect to see lots of activity. There's not a lot of activity. And one of the things that can happen is when we don't go into our body, when we don't have interoception, what can happen is that the brain looks for this body map that we all have, doesn't find anything there. And then the sensation of pain is actually coming as sort of a call, thanks, Jiro, a call into the body. And it's like, Joseph Campbell talked about a call to awakening on our journey, but pain is signaling, come in and start to reform that body map, start to sort of stitch it back together. And so how do we work with this idea that dissociation is a survival tactic? And that's true for a lot of us. It's really not any longer an expression of pathology.
So this, like I say, it's a 45-minute presentation, but quite fascinating about, again, a bottom-up approach. And it's interesting to point out that the Satipatthana Sutta, so this Buddhist teaching about mindfulness, starts with the body, which was my attraction to it, because that was my pathway out of depression, was working through the body. So this is not incongruent at all with some of the foundation of mindfulness itself, by the way. And I'll touch on a little bit on Dr. Sood. What I said actually in the paper is this is not an either or superior to inferior discussion for me. That is just, I think, foolhardy. It's really looking at what works for the individual now. And so it may be that it's simpler, more direct, as he said, instead of emptying the mind, filling the mind with positive intention, that maybe that's a place to begin. And then that leads to the capacity for focused awareness, longer-term ability to remain present. So I don't look at it as an either or. I made the case, this is not buying the new version and discarding an older version or a contemporary version that's been around for a number of years. It's really seeing the benefit of both, and then for the individual weighing which is going to be most helpful. That's my view. So what did I
We start to look.
Well, this is one other thing she said, which is really fascinating, by the way. So this was a different video, much more recent one. But she said, what makes a good MBSR teacher? She said, to me, it's not about that this person who has accomplished this finished product is mastery, whether it's in meditation or a yoga teacher, or she says, or what have you. But really, she said, from even herself included, is somebody who is engaging their own direct experience and distilling it somehow into growth or struggle or whatever, but is not the final product of evolution, some form of mastery. All I can say is hallelujah to her for saying that, because I fit into the second category, which is, direct experience. I'm trying to distill it. I'm trying to grow through it. I'm trying to deal with the struggle of life. Some things come fast and furious, and often can have many tragedies, like certainly I experienced in Dayton, piled on top of one another. I claim no mastery, but what I tried to do is remain present, grounded, functional, compassionate, make good decisions. I was just literally trying to do the best I could. And to me, that's what practice is. That's what a devoted practice, mindfulness, yoga, some body-mind practice, whatever. To me, that's it. So I really liked her commentary in this regard. And that's the YouTube link to that. So lastly, this is what I found, and I was really thanks Sandra Fraley, who was my teacher from 2010 to 2015, a retired professor of SUNY State University of New York of dance, but she also was a experienced yoga teacher, also certified in Feldenkrais, a modality, and just a remarkable teacher. She encouraged me to write this chapter that I wrote, and this is one of the quotes from it. I know personally how somatic practice can be a path out of the depths of depression and daily pain, when conscious movement illuminated through a felt sense is combined with elongated rhythmic breath. Further, I've learned how practice of moving consciously, when cultivated over time, allow the development of increased capacity to be present with and resolve intense physiological and emotional states, an inherent part of the recovery process. So that was my conclusion. And when I wrote that chapter, I wanted to not think this, my journey was my journey. It's what I gleaned from looking backwards over 25 years. But I also looked at research to support, well, what research supports physical movement as a healing modality? What supports a breath, paced breathing? What supports mindfulness? And so I built that in to the chapter that I wrote because I was curious myself. I know what helped me, but is there research out there to support these core elements that I saw as being essential to my recovery? Is there research to support that? When I found, yes, there is across all of those modalities, movement, breath, and awareness. So that was my realization, and it aligns very, very strongly with what Bo Forbes is saying, quite honestly. And that was the ending of the paper that I wrote, what I learned, and still serves me to this day. So that's it in a nutshell. So we have 30 minutes. John, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Richard. There's a lot there, and I know we do have the opportunity to be in discussion. And I see that I believe you've put two sets of questions together for us. So the first, let me just read out the first set of questions, and we'll quickly build some breakout rooms and take some time to be in conversation. So the first set of questions: what thoughts, emotions, or sensations, when noticed, indicate that you are outside of your resilient zone? And what helps you to return to balance, I guess, or return back into your resilient zone? And Richard, to see this, would you be willing to just revisit that definition? I thought that was such a thorough, provocative definition of resilience.
Yeah, resilience, the capacity to prepare for, recover from, and adapt to stress, adversity, trauma, and tragedy, and the ability to build and sustain resilience is related to self-management and efficient utilization of energy resources across 4 domains: physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual. And that's really the question of what helps one to return to balance, a more resilient state. What resources within those 4 realms often are helpful, that each of us find helpful? So for me, it's working through the body. I mean, I'll go back, I was a power lifter, I was a martial. I mean, I was very much a very physical person. So that was my primary domain, would be to go physical first. Not the only, but that certainly was my primary, because I had such a strong orientation toward that.
Richard, you when you say the 4 domains, I think and whoever else did, I can only hear 5 because I just can't imagine it without social. I mean,
Yes.
I like, so I almost kind of refuse to acknowledge that 4, because when I teach resilience and CISM and trauma resilience and recovery to incoming, basically I say move your body and stay with stay open to your people. Like if you do those 2 things, like you'll be able to do that. So I'm so surprised that didn't come up in the original, because I find it so central in all of my work.
I agree. And in my paper, I added that because Sood mentioned that, and I'm we co-regulate. We co-regulate. Now, excuse me. I don't know, it was either Porges or Van der Kolk said that but if we are not in a state of balance, in other words, if we're dysregulated, we are not going to help regulate someone else. So the key is, and if it's just 2 people, one of them has to be in a state of relative balance, or it's not going to work. It's like someone, some like police officer, get a scene, somebody's really distraught, and yelling at that person to calm down is not going to move the needle. Because yelling as someone is in a state of distress, not going to work.
Yeah. Yeah. So but that is a form of co-regulation. So what is being shared, right? So what's being shared is that dysregulation.
Yeah, I would say in that case I just gave. Yeah, it's. I think I'm trying to think who created the communication style, but it's about matching or mismatching communication styles. Whatever we match grows. So if someone's angry, we meet that with anger, it's just because it just causes escalation. If we're upset and we're interacting with someone who's upset, it's just probably going to drive greater dysregulation. So we want to alter that, change the energy, bring down the valence of it. We need to mismatch that in some way. One is by being calm or talking quietly so the person has to calm down to hear.
Yeah, we were discussing this in a training that we're doing in Canada with managers and talking about co-regulation. And some managers just know, there's a staff member coming down the hall to have a visit in the office, and they just kind of know what's coming through that door. And so there's a choice point, right? If you have those skills, right, you can kind of meet that, whatever that energy is going to be from that staff member coming in with the same force, or you can hopefully co-regulate through, as you're saying, staying regulated yourself, having a calm presence, voice, steady.
I think it's actually too, doing some mirroring. I remember I had a phone conversation with the police chief years and years ago. He called me about something really mundane. And so we were talking, he was from a adjacent jurisdiction, and he made some kind of off comment about his wife. And it just was like, wow, it just struck me. He said a few more things. And I said to him, that sounds painful to me. And literally, he just erupted in tears, just sobbed and sobbed and sobbed. All he really needed was someone to acknowledge what was painful in his life. Yeah, and that same thing happened with another colleague within the same week, a very difficult conversation. And I basically, not actually the same thing, but something similar. I said, that must have been difficult for you to be present during that conversation. Because they had to do with a police officer's son who had killed himself, and there was some history with this individual. And the same thing, tears just erupted and sobbing. So it's that quality of presence, calm, and compassionate listening and reflecting, mirroring back. It can be so absolutely powerful. I mean, so many of us, I think we just need permission or allowance. I don't even like the word permission, allowance for us to be with what's difficult, but not be alone in it. That's a great act of caring.
I've seen that in some critical incident stress management too, where talking about one thing ends up just, going through those questions just kind of triggers the question in someone else's mind about the thing that's really actually bothering them. That's not the thing you're talking about. So, just the process on one thing completely opens up the process on another. Another thing I wanted to mention about your presentation is I thought it was really interesting. The kind of combined, where I'm trying to find the right words, how measuring the effectiveness of mindfulness, when it's combined with some of these other modalities like wellness, kind of makes the waters murky. I was on a call earlier today that was about yoga and mindfulness, and like everyone, I didn't realize it at the time, and really didn't even get the chance to talk about it, but pretty much everybody was combining the two completely. And I mean, my head was about to explode because they're just not the same. And I really didn't even have the time, I didn't have the opportunity to just challenge everybody's definition that
Right.
they were using through this entire phone call of mindfulness. But the if you measured it the way they did, and then it would be completely intertwined with yoga. And so I agree very much with that too,
Yeah, it's
that
interesting.
observation.
Interesting that Sood, this paper I just finished, which was the twice the length of this one that we're talking about. Two studies of SMART I found that I looked at. And remember, Dr. Sood's criticism is like, well, some mindfulness programs have yoga in it. We can't really tell what isn't, which one is influencing what necessarily. And so that basically creates some confusion or complexity about teasing out the mechanism of change and which one is effective or affecting certain outcomes. But it's interesting, the two studies of SMART that I highlighted, one include paced diaphragmatic breathing. So that's not just mindfulness. The second study I don't have that, I put that in my office, but I was able to find a handout that at least showed some of it, talked about certain skills, mental skills. And within that, they had yoga. Well, it's not just mindfulness practice then. So the very thing he criticizes in some mindfulness studies were in fact elements in the SMART program, at least two studies that I looked at that utilize that as an intervention mechanism for resilience. So it's a confusing world of research. I've got a lot in this more recent paper, which would be probably hard to distill in a presentation, but it is not, research is not as slam dunk as we like to think it is, because you're dealing with, well, one of the studies I looked at had a lot of studies that exhibited bias. In other words, the reliability of the outcomes were questionable because of inherent bias within the test itself, within the study itself. So you got study bias, you have small sample sizes, you have a lot of really inactive controls, wait list or no intervention at all. You would think that doing something is better than doing nothing in terms of people receiving some benefit, if there's any reason to believe that intervention has been helpful or is likely to be helpful. So I don't like wait list, control studies, because I don't think that's a very strong measure. So the scientific rigor matters. The size of these test population matters. The diversity of the test population matters. So is it generalizable beyond just the individuals represented in the study? So there's just a lot that goes into research.
I think there's a lot of research too that doesn't have very much longevity. And so and it's like, oh, 100% of people felt good
Yeah.
after this yoga class, and it's like, well,
Yeah.
okay. I mean, you just breathed and, moved your body like you're going to, like, how is it going to change your life? I mean, how is it going to, support you when you're not in class?
Yeah, the gold standards is randomized controlled trials, longitudinal studies, so studies over time, not just pre-post. So those are two of the key. And then replication. Can another study using the same design, same modality produce the same outcomes? So those are kind of the three big ones in terms of reliability or confidence in outcomes. And they're expensive to do. Longitudinal studies aren't cheap. Randomized controlled trials are complex. And because of that, they often use very small test populations, which is kind of then hard to have confidence. 20 people did X, they felt better. Well, is that generalizable beyond the 20 people? Highly questionable.
So many challenges with research in so many different domains. But
With that said, one comment I made in another paper was on Qigong as a potential potent remedy for trauma, was that oftentimes anecdotal or clinical evidence is ahead of the evidence from empirical studies. Those are oftentimes further downstream modalities, which I absolutely support empirical research. But just because there's not an empirical study that says, quote, X works, doesn't mean that it doesn't work. It just means it probably hasn't been studied or studied sufficiently or studied with enough scientific rigor to be able to say that it works. So it's different than, I mean, a lot of clinical practitioners know their patients are getting better, particularly with some things they may be doing that are, well, Bo Forbes found that when she began to bring yoga practice in with the clients she was counseling. They just seemed to do better with that added, not as a exclusion to counseling, but as a strong adjunct to it.
That's why I like the term promising practices. I think that if you have elements of different things that have been shown in research to be effective, and you have no reason to believe that in combination there's going to be something antithetical to what you're trying to achieve. I mean, I was once a very into the research kind of person. Back when they first started talking about evidence-based practices and corrections, and working with Ed Latessa, University of Cincinnati, who was leftist, but a great guy, but I really found myself too rigid and not really open to evidence-based practices being really, before you have as you said, the clinical rigor and the research rigor, knowing that it's promising, knowing that you're getting good results. And it's one of the things that concerns me lately is the meta-analysis that's taken of probably a lot of poor studies. Recently, there was a meta-analysis study, and I've had a hard time finding it again, that apparently went through a bunch of social emotional learning programs for kids in school and declared that they were harmful to the kids' mental health and were damaging kids, and that social emotional learning should not be done. And that's very troubling to me, because I do think it has a lot to do with the curriculum and all the elements that you mentioned, and just what are the elements of the program, and how well versed, how true to the curriculum do people stay. And it's research can be very damaging to some really good stuff that's promising and actually doing good in many settings.
Yeah, a couple other things that affected too is the integrity of implementation. There's the model, and then there's reality, right? And the other one is compliance on the part of the people who are participating in the study. For instance, one study by Rosch I looked at, Rosch is her last name. She actually did a interview, so she did a qualitative analysis of people who went through MBSR, and it was a total of 17 people between two cohorts. But she found out a lot of them acknowledged they weren't doing the home practices. Well, it's not going to work if you don't do it, So those are some of the other issues too.
Yeah, absolutely. Unless you can house people, feed them, put them to bed, get them up, get them practicing. Yeah, all of these become a little wiggly.
Yeah, I just want no in my bones to be an acceptable, no check, because I mean, there's certain things, and it's like, oh, this you see it over and over, but it's not necessarily.
Well, shall we take some time to discuss in small groups? I'll adjust the time a little bit shorter. Let's make it 10 minutes, so we'll have a little bit of time to debrief. But again, if you take a look into your chat, everyone, you'll see the two questions: what thoughts, emotions, or sensations when noticed indicate that you're outside of your resilience zone, and two, what helps you return to balance. So why don't we take a few minutes talking together, and we'll see you back in about 10 minutes. Just a reminder, we come back and the microphones have all been automatically muted. So you're welcome to unmute.
And we are still recording.
We are still recording.
I wanted to thank Chief Biehl and so many good points you brought out, Chief, and really pertinent both for our practice and for this time. But as we were speaking in our little breakout room, I just had this reflection on my first Vipassana teacher, and I was going to add this, but we all disappeared. It all comes down to humility. I mean, can you apologize when you've misstepped or you realize you've come in like Porges' work? You come in with a frown and the tone of your voice just hurts the other person. You have to be sensitive enough to pick up on those return signals. And I liked your example of mirroring. My MBSR teacher had us do practices where, somebody makes a statement and you actually repeat it back to them and you say, am I hearing you correctly? And then, well, you said all the tears and everything, but this is great. And are we meeting next week or again? Robert?
Robert?
Yes, we are meeting on the 27th. And every week, as far as I know, we don't have canceled any interviews. So, of course, circumstances are such, we didn't really know how many people would get tonight. We got a couple RSVPs that people had other things going on or had medical issues or whatever. But yeah, we'll be here next week. And actually, I will not be. I'll be traveling, but we do have a program planned. Actually, at least a session planned, no particular program.
Well, I want to make sure that I thank you for all your work, John, and all the people on the screen, because this has been a really rich Wednesday night event, repeated many, many times. So happy holidays, Merry Christmas, and if I see somebody next week, if I'm here, I'll wish you a Happy New Year then.
I'd like to add happy solstice to that, which is
yeah.
tomorrow. I dropped a link in the chat. I in the morning have a winter solstice kind of intention setting worksheet that I'm going to send out to a lot of my friends, and actually I did a guided meditation that's about 7 minutes long with some suggestions for a winter solstice kind of intention setting practice. So
That's
if you
all
would,
of us.
so yeah, if you'd like it, just click that link in the chat and I'll your email will be on there. I didn't mean to take attention from I loved tonight's conversation. I mean, like what it's I know this in my bones, and I just appreciate hearing it from you, Richard, because I trust your research and knowledge so much. So, but yes, happy solstice, and if I could share my practice with you, I'd be grateful.
That's great that you did share that, because it's winter solstice. It's time to celebrate that and to experience it. And I appreciate you sharing that. I'll see that everybody gets that link, and also that you get the slides from tonight. I'll take care of that as soon as I get off the call. And Richard, it was a very rich discussion. We could spend a lot of time on these. We didn't even get to the second set, but I do love your new broader definition of resilience. It's very meaty and seems more complete. And I really, really have loved working with that, and having the paper in advance was very helpful to me. So thank you for that.
Well, you're most welcome. And then the last paper is awe, mindfulness, and the resilience connection. And there are a lot of other interesting parts of that I think everyone will enjoy at some point. I would be welcome to certainly present that, and thank Katie, by the way, for sending some resources my way. I am citing Jeff Thompson and a couple of studies in that final paper, thanks to a connection through Katie. So listen, thank you all for being your kind attention and your engagement. Barb and I had a great conversation. It was so much fun. I really appreciate it. And best of the holidays to you all. And hopefully we'll see maybe some of you next week. And if not, we'll see you in the new year.
Be well, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Good to see you,
Good
Eileen.
night, everyone.
Best of the holidays, everyone. Be
Bye.
well, be safe.
Thank you.